Good morning. I'd like to thank the 15 of you that decided to skip out on lunch and come hear me talk. I'd like to thank you for that. One of my biggest fears was once I saw a schedule during lunchtime that everybody was going to go eat lunch and I was going to be talking to an empty room. So thanks for coming. During my talk, if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, you'd like to, just feel free to interrupt me. Make this as interactive as possible. So, start out. Just once again, make sure you're in the right session. This is Tablet PC Design Considerations. My name is Ken Vassallo. I'm a consultant with Microsoft Consulting Services. I've been working with the tablet doing development for just over 2 years now. Since January, I've been working with the tablet team across the country working on tablet adoption deployments. So any customer that deploys more than 1,000 tablets, I go out and work with them. This talk is based on my experiences developing tablet PC applications. So we talk about design considerations, we're going to talk about UI, all things that I always used to blow off as a Windows developer and think weren't important. Design considerations to me, when I used to do Windows development, was I'd make a label on the text box in bold. And I'm like, oh, look at that, that's great. But when you do tablet PC development, all of a sudden things start changing because of the form factor that you really didn't consider before. Not only do you not have, you can use the mouse as input, but you have a pen that uses input also. So my talk is based on what I've seen working out with customers over the last 2 years. There's also a section in the Tablet PC SDK that talks all about the details of design guidelines. And there's a book, Developing Tablet PC Applications, that has a whole chapter dedicated to UI guidelines, what to do. This is kind of an abridged version of that stuff plus what I've seen working with customers. First thing we'll talk about is our agenda. The one thing to take in consideration is to know how your application is going to be used. I'll talk about some real-life scenarios that I ran into where we went into the project really not knowing early on how our application was going to be used, and it came back, in a sense, to bite us. We're going to talk about display orientation. With a Windows desktop or a laptop, you have landscape mode. That's what you do your development in. With a tablet, not only do you have landscape, but you have portrait. And you also have the concept you don't know if your application is going to be in portrait mode or in landscape mode. You have hand obstruction. So when I was doing my Windows development, I had the mouse off to the left or right side, and my biggest obstruction was the I bar scrolling across my screen. Now I have this concept of hand obstruction. I have my hand that actually covers part of the screen as I'm writing. So we'll talk about some techniques of how to minimize issues with that. Recognition. We have this new concept of an ink data type, if you will. And the role of ink in your application, we'll talk about inking inside the application as opposed to inking outside the application. We'll talk about converting ink as opposed to leaving ink as ink. One of the things that I first go in and talk to customers, I always tell them that with ink comes recognition. With recognition comes the possibility of errors, which means your end users are now going to be spending time correcting errors. So my biggest thing, and the biggest challenge always seems to be with customers is if you have fields that are going to be notes fields, or I have fields that are not going to be, I'm not going to key off of. I just have this data, I want to store it, I want to be able to retrieve it, I want to be able to show it to other people. There's nothing wrong with the concept of leaving ink as ink. Talk about real estate. When I did my Windows Forms development, I dropped my text box. It was 20 pixels high, and I drop a bunch of them, and I have my label controls. But now I have this concept of I cannot ink inside of a 20-pixel high text box. I can do it, but it will frustrate the end users, and the recognition engine will have a greater difficulty recognizing my ink because I'm focused on, as the end user, I'm focused on writing very small. I'm not focused on the concept of just get the ink in there. I'm more concerned about that. And writing small, the recognizer will have more trouble with that. With the SDK, there are also some controls. We'll talk about the role of controls in your application. We'll talk about pen input versus a mouse. So as I said before, with the mouse, I had this device off to the left of my screen. Now I have a pen with a hand and an arm attached to it, which is interesting. And we'll talk about hardware considerations. One of the biggest things I see is when I go into customers, they tell me they're a Dell shop or they're an IBM shop, and that's all they buy. And I always tell them that the platform, the OEM manufacturers, there's a difference between the platforms. Buy the device that's right for you. So if you're looking for a rugged device that's waterproof, explore the 2 or 3, I think there's up to 5 manufacturers now that have ruggedized devices. If you're looking for a device that battery life is your most important feature, because everybody wants battery life. I would love a battery that lasts, the same as my cell phone. Buy the device that has a longer battery life. If I'm going to be outside, test your different devices in the outside. Test them in the environment that they're going to be used in. So it's kind of an agenda of what we'll talk about. And here's the horrible background that I went through when I first started doing tablet development. The first application I wrote for the tablet PC back in January of 2 years ago, whatever that was, 2002. I got an assignment, Ken, go write this tablet application for a claims adjuster. Integrate it into MapPoint and Word and all this other stuff. I thought, great. I went out and I wrote my code and I developed it for the tablet PC in portrait mode. And what happened was, because of all this other integration, everybody else wanted to use this app for demo purposes, but not on the tablet. But I developed it in portrait mode for the tablet. So, I had all these people showing my app off with a big gap at the side of the screen and scrolling it down, which lost the meaning of the app. So the concept that I'm trying to convey is understand, is your app going to be used in portrait mode, portrait or landscape mode? Is it for a desktop only? Is it, for a tablet only? Or is it going to be also used on a desktop? It changes the way that you do your design. One of the customers I went out to work with, we developed a inking application for loan processing. They wanted to go out and talk to their customers, capture ink on their application. And great, easy enough task. Went out, we developed some forms for them, included inking in the forms. And they had some older users. This was for a bank, and some of their banking officers were in their 60s. And the concept of a tablet was pretty far out there for them. So one of the things they came back with was, oh, gee, that's a great application you guys developed in portrait mode for the tablet. But you know what else is? We want to use it with a keyboard also now, because some people are not comfortable with a pen. So once again, I can't stress enough, when you go into the app, when you go into your project, understand how your application is going to be used, what platform it's going to be used, what modes it could possibly be used in. The first thing we'll drill down in some detail on is display orientation. Traditional Windows apps have always been done in landscape mode. Now, it was easy. I knew exactly the device, the monitor was going to be in front of me. Develop it in landscape mode, not a big deal. Interesting thing is tablet PC applications, most of the time, are in portrait mode. There was actually a study done, and there's some documentation, I believe, in the SDK on this, that whatever mode I open up my tablet in, whatever feature I'm going to do first with my tablet, tends to be the mode I keep it in. So if I'm going to open it up and I'm going to do some coding, I'm going to open up my tablet and I'm going to keep it, if I have a convertible unit, I'm going to have it in landscape mode, and I'm going to go ahead and write code. Well, if I read a Word document after that, I'm going to tend to leave it in landscape mode. However, if I open up my tablet to read a document to start with, I'll open it up in portrait mode. I'll have a tendency to keep it in portrait mode for the rest of the time, the rest of the session that I'm using it, until I'm forced to go in and use the keyboard. In convertible form factors now, there's the slate model. With convertible form factors, I have the ability now to be using it in portrait mode and dynamically switch it over and use it in landscape mode, dynamically switch it back and use it in portrait mode. So what this gets to is to test your application in both layouts. The last thing you want to do is develop an application in portrait mode, have the user use it in landscape mode, and have them scrolling to get to the bottom of your application forms. Implement orientation-specific layouts. I'm going to do a code sample that will show how to detect the message, the Windows message, to grab it and then tell the application, oh, the tablet's now in portrait mode. Nope, now it's back in landscape mode. So I'll switch over to Visual Studio. My first application demo. I used to have a Visual Studio. It's a C# Windows project that I opened up. And for this project, I'm just going to take and drop a label control on my form. So everybody can see it in back. I'll set the font. Large enough. In my namespace, I'll add my using statement. And then in my form load event, I'm just going to go ahead and send an event that will get kicked off when the tablet PC, when that event fires off, the application will handle it and say, I got it, throw it into this function. And then I'll write a function that will grab this event. And all I'm going to do for this is just change the label control to tell me I'm in portrait mode or I'm in landscape mode. And I'm going to declare a rectangle object and set the rectangle equal to the screen so that it will tell me the functions. If the width is greater than the height, I can test that after I declare my rectangle. Now I'm just going to simply run a test. Check to see if the height is greater than the width. If it is, for this example, I'm just going to do nothing more than set the label control. So if height is greater than width, it means I am in portrait mode. Else, I will be in landscape. And I believe that's it. Always a good sign. There we go. And now if I take my application, if I take the tablet, and as soon as I start to switch it over, an event gets fired, the application handles it, and it says, oh, now I'm in portrait mode. Switch it back, an event gets fired and says, now I'm in landscape mode. What this is important for is you always want to detect the orientation of how the user is going to use your app. Unless it's a business rule that, hey, we're always going to be in landscape or in portrait mode, and that's the way the app is written, always want to detect because you never know how the user is going to use the app, and you will get interesting results as the orientation changes. Any questions on that? Yes? Does the event get fired when the application starts? I would have to say it gets fired when I do a switch, whenever I switch the mode, but not when it starts. And the reason I say that is because it detects already and didn't change my label control. Any other questions? Okay. Yes? I included, let me scroll up really quick, the Microsoft Win32 in my using namespace. It's just so I can grab the Windows event. My application is ready to listen for the Windows event. I said listen for the one I'm interested in is the system event of display settings changed. So when that gets fired, call my function. No. I just wait and I just had that one using statement in there. Right. The interesting thing is that if I'm designing new applications for the tablet PC, right, I want to make sure that I know how it's going to switch. And yeah, it could become confusing for the users. But going forward as I'm designing applications, unless I have this business rule of I'm always going to be in portrait mode, which I haven't experienced except for one customer yet that had that rule that said we developed a camera for them. So they ended up using a Slate model as a camera. They had the old Pocket PC camera with a converter to go to the PC MCIA, and the business rule was we're always going to have this in portrait mode, and we programmed the buttons for it. So everything was designed specifically for portrait mode. So unless there's a rule, I've seen users constantly, I do it all the time, I'm switching back and forth. And with other applications, it could cause confusion of the layout, but as I'm going forward developing applications, I want to make sure that I don't add to the confusion. Yeah, if you notice, when I'm in Office now, right, it doesn't give me a lot of times it will format or reformat when the display changes, right? If I'm in landscape mode and I bring up Office, when I switch over to portrait mode, everything switches for me and it expands out fully to maximize the screen. But as we go forward, I anticipate more and more applications will be detecting for portrait mode changing, and also rely, I've seen a lot of emails with the next topic I'm going to talk about, rely on handedness changes. Because it's just things, they're different design considerations now that I have a different form factor. I have a form factor I'm holding as opposed to a stationary one, or one that I hold that is the monitor on the laptop is stationary. Any other questions? Okay. Next topic. If I'm not covering the topic, if I don't answer your question, please just stop me and I'll be happy to talk more about it. Next topic I'll talk about is hand obstruction. When I developed applications for my desktop or even for my laptop, I didn't have to worry about my hand and my arm covering parts of the screen. Now with the tablet, I have a whole new concept of actions could be taking place underneath where my arm is. And the interesting thing about this is, if you notice, tooltips and menus tend to drop down to the right side. If I'm a right-handed user and I'm hovering over something, the tooltip's probably going to pop up underneath my right hand. If I'm a right-handed user on a menu and I click to drop down a menu, the menu's going to come underneath my right hand. Scroll bars, however, are in a sense designed for right-handed users, because if I'm right-handed and that scroll bar is off to the right side, I can drag and I can see my form moving up and down and I know exactly where I'm at. However, if I switch roles and I'm a left-handed user, as a left-handed user, I see the menus and the tooltips perfectly, but as I'm scrolling, my arm is now covering the area that I'm scrolling, so I don't know exactly what's going on underneath my hand, underneath my arm. So what we're going for is ensure that state changes do not occur underneath your hand, whether you're right-handed or left-handed. And there's a system parameters info that we can check, and it goes to the control panel. And in control panel, when I first open up my tablet PC application, when I first open up my tablet PC, I can set if I'm a right-handed or a left-handed person. I'm going to jump to a demo, and I'll jump back on and bring up one more point on that. Let me give myself a reminder. Once again, I just have a Visual Studio C# project. I do my famous drop my label control on here. And once again, inside my project, I'm going to add my using statement, this time for interop. And I'm going to go ahead and declare two variables. And the other, I'm going to do an import from the user32 DLL. There we go. So it's going to go out to have a function that goes out to control panel so I can actually grab the system parameters and tell me if I'm set for a left-handed or right-handed user. Reference Boolean. Next line. Okay, that should do it. And then in my form load event, I'm just going to go out and make a call to the system parameters info and pass it in magic ref right-handed 0. And I'm simply going to check to see if right-handed is true or false and do nothing more than set my label control accordingly. Okay. With a little luck, get some. Okay, so set for left-handed. If I go into control panel and I take a look, under my tablet and pen settings, I'll notice that I'm set for left-handed. If I switch it over to right-handed and I rerun my application, it comes up and it tells me I'm right-handed. Now, setting the label control for left-handed or right-handed really isn't the point. The point is grabbing the system setting and then act accordingly. So whether I drop my toolbars down to the right or left side is a UI decision, Whether I have my scroll bar set on the right side of the screen or the left side of the screen is a UI decision. But the point being that what I can do is I can go and grab to know if the user is set for a right-handed or left-handed user and then act accordingly. Because the last thing I want to do is make the pen harder for the user to use by blocking things happening underneath their hand or arm. No, there isn't, other than the concept of I want to display a scroll bar to the right side if right-handed, else hide that scroll bar and display the scroll bar to the left side. Or go to the concept of different concepts in the UI. Hide certain things, show certain things. It's just a decision that you have to make going into your application. Am I going to account for right-handed and left-handed users? And if I am, I'm going to be considerate enough to account for them. Then I'm going to have to do some UI changes. The same way I would suggest the display orientation between portrait and landscape. There's no magic of, I'm in portrait now, automatically switch me over. Yeah, my application will flip over, but it won't be formatted the way I might need it to be formatted, which means having, in a sense, UI changes. Yes? It depends on what's on the form, right? I would look at it and say that if I have a form, one of the first projects that we worked on, I had a form where I just had the user buttons off to the side. And it was a Fujitsu Slate tablet, and they were using the buttons to actually take a picture of the camera, right? And it was off to the right side. Well, I couldn't ask a left-handed user to either hold the tablet upside down or to flip over and do this. So in that instance, what we ended up doing is just having a different UI for it, right? But if I was if I have my main screen, it's just a scroll bar possibly, and a couple of different things on there, then I would just go ahead and actually have one UI with just do the hide and show concept. But it's all design considerations. It's all things you have to take into account up front and make decisions based accordingly. Yes. Right. That's a good question. And it's one, actually, I got to be honest with you, I've thought a lot about this stuff, and I've never actually considered that or taken that in consideration. What I can do is take a note and send it in. Hey, this is because I got to be honest with you, it is a good idea. So, any other questions, thoughts? Okay. Switch over. Recognition. We talked a little about recognition up front. The concepts that I always go in, let me switch the screen. The concepts I always go in to tell customers is the role of ink in your application is a decision, once again, that you make up front. Customers always have, the first response I always tell them when I suggest leaving ink as ink is always, we need all our data. We need all our data to be converted to text. And that's great, and I understand if that's a real requirement, go ahead and convert it all over to text. However, if that's not a requirement, if I'm only going to search on fields, key fields in my database that are going to tie into other tables, my recommendation is if I'm not going to be doing that, if I have notes fields, I can still search on ink in a database. There's some ways around that I need to code myself, but I can still search on ink within a database. There's no reason to take all your ink and convert it over to text unless absolutely necessary. It makes it a lot easier on the user. Ink recognition is not 100%. It depends on the user. There's times where I write on my tablet that I can't do anything wrong. I try to get an error and I can't. There's other times where I can't seem to do anything right while I'm writing. It all depends. And it's based on me, how I'm writing, what I'm thinking while I'm writing. Am I really thinking of what I'm writing? So if we're going for the concept where I want to get ink in there. I can store my ink. I can retrieve my ink. Other non-tablet users want to see my ink. You know what? Save it as ink, store it into a database. I can create a byte array, put it in there, pop it into a database as an image field, bring it back out, no problems at all. It will display on non-tablet users as just an image. I can't edit the ink on a non-tablet user, but I can see what was entered in that field. If I'm entering data or worked with remotely with a company, I believe it was in Germany, where they were entering it for healthcare ambulance. They wanted to really quick mark some checks on a box, enter some data. And one of the things I suggested to them was, you can enter all this data, and you want to get it converted, but you can always convert ink also at a later point in time. It doesn't need to be converted right now. I can store it in a database, bring it back out, and convert it over at a later time. So recognition is an interesting topic because sometimes it works great for some users, and sometimes it works at 90, 95% for other users, which means that the concept is if I'm going to convert my ink over, give the users tools to make it easier to convert ink. So if I have my application and it's going to convert ink to text, my biggest recommendation is don't have them hold a pen over a certain point in pixel and on a text box to get a drop down before that letter that they want to change. Give them the ability of, hey, here's the UI. I can move my cursor back and forth. I can change letters with big buttons to move it. I'll show you an example in just a few minutes on that. The other recommendation on converting ink is the recognition engine, and this slide is from our 1.5. With 1.7, some of these terms have changed to the SDK. But use everything in your power to help the recognizer recognize the ink. I can go ahead and I can create word lists. So I have a field, for example, and I'm a doctor, and this field is going to be some medical terms, a list of 50 medical terms. Load that up and say, this field for the recognizer, hey, only recognize one of these 50 terms. Create a word list for it. I have things called factoids, which is now, in a sense, a context, setting a context. I can go ahead and say, I want this field to be a state code or a state field, only recognize states. No matter how bad I write, as long as, for example, I write the word Washington and I can recognize WA, as the first two letters, use the factoids along with the course. The course tells me, hey, only return me what's in the factoid, make the factoid work, or the word list. Don't return me anything else that you think it might be. Along with that, and I'll show you an example, is guides. Guides can help. They can be a detriment, but they also can help. It's something to keep in mind of, as I'm taking notes, if I'm going to convert it to handwriting, here's lines on paper. People are used to seeing lines on paper. They're used to writing in lines on paper. It helps the recognizer to know, this is the bottom line, this is the top line, here's a midpoint. These things help the recognizer. Do everything you can if you need to convert to help the recognizer. Yes? Right. With the 1.7 SDK, I now have something called regular expressions. And with regular expressions, I can say this is a social security number. Right? Recognize this field as a number, dash, number, dash, number. Right? Along with that, I'll do a quick side sample of this. I'm sorry, do you have anything follow up on that question? Did I answer? Okay. Let's see if I bring this up. This is just a VB6 app that I just threw together in a few seconds one day to show someone the concept, the difference between using a factoid or a context, if you will, context tag in a field. So when I go over my field now, move it into right. That's pretty poor handwriting, but it knows that it's a state field. So it's forcing the recognizer to say, this is a state field, pick one of the 50 states only and return me that. So as you can see, the context I can set around a field can greatly help the recognizer. And I recommend, when you go into an application, strongly strongly recommend using those concepts to help the recognizer. Anything you can do to help the recognizer is going to make it easier on the end user using the application to convert their text over. And this is what I was talking about before about making it easier for the end user. What I had done here, and I believe there's a demo coming up of this in the next slide, in-place recognition. There was an interesting, there was a lot of constraints as we had done this. One of the things that U.S. Bank had wanted was they wanted their forms to look exactly the same. Their users are comfortable with our forms. We want them to look exactly the same, but we want to be able to provide inking on the form. And this goes back to the inking in an application as opposed to inking outside of an application. What I mean by that, if I were inking in an application, I would be filling out and writing, for example, right here, I would be trying to fit my handwriting in to write on that spot. When I ink, in a sense, outside of an application, I can go ahead and do something like, I notice right here it shows up and it says, years business established, which is my next available box, and I can write, 1943. It comes back, and let's say I meant to write a 7 instead of a 3. By that I mean, I can go back, and I have tools now, nice big buttons that the user can move the cursor around, can do things to correct the ink. So this is just an example. This is one example of inking outside of an application and giving the user tools to make correcting ink easy. Because the one thing I want to make sure I do, is give them the ability, if the recognizer doesn't work, to make it easy for them to change it. I don't want to frustrate the user and have them, go through a bunch of hoops in order to change or correct ink that's not recognized correctly. And that brings us to our next topic of real estate. Real estate becomes an interesting topic as you're developing your forms. Back in, I started writing code years ago, it was always, here's my application, here's my forms I want filled out. Go ahead and take these forms and translate them over to the desktop, the PC, and let the user just go ahead and type and tab to the next field and type and tab to the next field, and the form looks identical to what the form looks like on paper. Well, that's not always the case as you do tablet PC applications. Things like when I drop a text box on a form, as on Windows form, a text box is 20 pixels high on a Windows form. For me to ink inside of a 20 pixel high text box can be difficult to do. So you have to keep in mind, do I want to ink inside the form? Do I want to ink outside the form? If I ink inside the form, I believe my next slide, I run into things like this where I'm making things bigger in order to capture the ink. My forms aren't going to be the same. And it's just a design consideration. Do I want to go ahead and change the way the form actually looks and feels on paper to what it translates to the screen? Or in the U.S. Bank example that I had shown, difficult for the recognizer to recognize when I'm writing this small on a text. Now, there's a limit. Granted, I don't need anything that big, but within limitations, the bigger I get, the easier, the more clearly I write, the easier the recognizer has to grab the ink, strokes, and convert it over. Also, with real estate, you run into the concept of things like drop-down boxes, check boxes, a close button at the top of the screen, although are bigger on the tablet PC than on a Windows desktop, can still be somewhat complicated for the user to use. If I have a scroll bar at the right side of the screen, and and it's a normal standard scroll bar, and I got my pen and I'm working on scrolling, well, yeah, that's great, but it would be better if I had a scroll bar that's possibly 10 pixels wider, so I don't have to aim right on that exact button. Same with the checkbox. I have a checkbox, and checkboxes are very easy to use with the tablet PC. I write applications all the time, check, 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 boom. But if I want to go ahead and make the application a little bit easier, I can go ahead and expand the checkbox just a little bit to give the user a bigger target to aim for. And this is just the example of there's no way, in a sense, let me put it this way, I have to be creative, and I'll show you an example of how to be creative. It's a little bit of how to go ahead and ink on a standard form and capture that ink. And actually, Franklin Covey, the Agilix guys, did a great job, and I'm going to show that in a little bit, of how to go ahead, one of the concepts of how to go ahead and do that. Before I go there, I'm going to talk briefly about ink controls. The SDK comes with 3 standard ink controls. It comes with a whole set of managed APIs where if you were in a talk yesterday, I believe there's another one today at 1:45, 3:15. I would have got it eventually. At 3:15, it's going to go into more details about the APIs. But there's the API role to go, and there's the ink control role to go. With the ink, I have in my toolbox the ink edit and the ink picture and the pip control, and I can just drag the edit and the picture control onto my form. But with the managed APIs, I do have a little bit more control. So the ink edit control, it's just a text box. It's derived from the rich text box. I can drop it on my control. I can do I can take the strokes, collect the ink, pass it to the recognizer, automatically does it for me, returns text. But with going outside and going to the managed APIs, I have more control. It's almost like driving an automatic transmission to driving a manual transmission. I control what's going where and when it goes. And with the managed APIs, I can control what's going where. With the ink edit control, I write text onto a box. It takes, at a given time, a property that I set. It takes that, passes it into the recognizer, passes me back the text the recognizer got. With the managed APIs, I can grab those ink strokes. I pass them in. I can set flags and say, you know what, force this to be a factoid, or I'm sorry, a word mode, and force it into here and get me back what I want. I control what the process. And that goes to the bottom point of the ink edit versus the ink overlay, which we talked about a little bit yesterday, and Aaron will talk about today at 3:15. The pip control came out in the 1.5 SDK, and it was, in a sense, a real estate screensaver. The pip control is actually where that US Bank concept came from, of in-place editing, in a sense, editing outside of the application. With the 1.7 SDK, in the new release of the tablet PC operating system, I now have the ability to ink outside all my applications if I want, if I so choose, or I can ink inside my application. It's a lot easier now. It comes standard with the new 2004 edition. But once again, it becomes a real estate saver because by inking, I need bigger text boxes. Inking outside of an application, I can ink on this platform, if you will, this box, this movable box, and I can write my code, and then it gets sent in. So I don't need to make things bigger. I can have standard-sized forms. It just makes life a lot easier. But it all depends on what the concept is that you're going for. One of my favorite topics, which you saw in here, if you're inking outside of the form, use the guides, create an ink overlay area, use recognizer context, which we talked about a little bit before about the factoids of word list. Give the user the ability to have the alternate. So the recognizer, you pass the ink strokes in, the recognizer returns not only what it thinks it is, it returns a list of alternates. Give those to the user. And let them select, if I'm going and correcting text, let them select, oh no, but it is right here. This isn't the word, but it's the one on my alternate list. With real estate, and I think I close this down. Yep. Design mode. The concept of taking a form and just transferring it over onto an application. There we go. Always looks good. However, as you can see, in my mind, this would not be a very usable form. I don't have the ability in here to really write a lot of ink, right? So the concept of real estate and inking inside the application becomes challenging. Now, with that is also the concept of I can do things to work around that. One of the examples here in InfoPath with the SP1 release, as I'm writing my ink, you notice that in a sense, the text box kept growing and growing and growing as I was writing. So in a sense, the ability that I have a form, but I can go ahead and take like an ink edit control and just keep expanding it out to let the user write onto the form and then convert it back over. Convert back over and put it into that form. If I gave the user just that simple box to go ahead and try and write in that single box, it's not a lot of room to write in. It does look exactly like the form that they wanted, but it's not very usable. This is an example that I have actually thought was probably the best example I've ever seen of how to go ahead and expand. What Agilix did for Franklin Covey is you can see as I go ahead, there we go. Right, it just takes my ink, and when I'm done writing, it just shrinks it back down and puts it into that box. Now, granted, I wrote a lot, and that's not readable. Most of the time, I'm not going to write that much. But if I go back on there, it just expands out. So by hovering over it, it can expand out. So just different ideas of how you can go ahead, enter ink into an application, and save it, either converting it over, save it as ink, keeping the form factor that you want with the standard forms on translated over to the tablet. But just different ideas. It becomes a very creative process as you're developing your forms. And it's just things that you need to consider up front as opposed to, gee, I want this form just converted over to tablet PC. I'm going to drop my ink edit controls down, and now it becomes a non-usable form. Any questions so far? Comments? Anything else? Okay. Yes. I'll answer the first part of the question, and I'll let Frank answer the second part. The first part of the question is, for example, with InfoPath and the ink edit control, comes automatically in there. Visual Studio, when I download the SDK, I get the standard one. I can go ahead and write my own code to expand things and do magic things. But now Frank can answer the second part of what's available. Yes. Well, what happens, I can load up my list at runtime, right? Or I can load it up as the application comes up, and I can, modify. I can either do one of a number of things. It becomes a programming trade-off, right? Either I can go ahead and say, use this word list, attach it here, or create a word list and attach it here, depending. The big thing to me, and I'm not saying this is a fact, the big thing to me is loading up the word list, which isn't a big deal. Right, go ahead and actually populate in that word list each time in your application. Now you can go ahead and I believe, and I haven't done this, but I believe you can have the external word list, where I can have a text file and just point to the text file of word list. But to answer your question, no, it's not a big deal to go ahead and change those. I have not run into an issue doing that. So, but one of the things to keep in mind is if that is something you'll be doing in your application, test the case out early up front. To see, because once again, there's also different hardware platforms. I have, for example, 4 tablets at home. I have the new M200, which is a 1.7 gigahertz with a gig of RAM. It's a regular laptop. That thing flies. I also have a Pentium 3 733 megahertz with 256K of RAM. Right? It works great, but there's definitely a difference. I can tell the difference between the two. But it goes back, it comes to our last topic of hardware considerations of, what are the trade-offs and what am I going for and what am I trying to do? once again, you add processor speed, you add a little weight, you add battery life, you add a little weight. Is weight important? If light, if a small form factor that's light is important as opposed to weight, it's just kind of a trade-off. It depends on what you're going for. Any other questions? Great. Pen input. The interesting thing is, I always compare this to when I was doing DOS applications, I had the keyboard, and I didn't really have the concept of the mouse yet, right? And all of a sudden, Windows came out, and I had the mouse available to me as an input device. So now I had the user going and doing the keyboard, and I had them using the mouse, and it was just a new way of thinking from the use of mouse. And I compare that the same to now I have a mouse, and I have a pen. That's just a new way of thinking of now I have another input device. And with that input device comes the same subtleties of, no one's ever going to leave the keyboard to use a mouse. The same concept of I have little subtleties between using the keyboard and the mouse now and using the mouse and the pen. And things, when I'm using a mouse, my hand is stationary, it's resting. The only muscle I really use to use a mouse is, I don't remember the name of it, but I actually learned this at one time. There's something inside my finger, points down to click the mouse button. Right? And now I have the roller mouse, so I don't have to actually much use the mouse. I can move the cursor back and forth, up and down, all with one finger. But the point is everything's stationary. With a pen, I now have a hand attached and an arm. And I have multiple fingers holding the pen. As I have the pen on the screen, things that I took for granted, like a single mouse click or a double mouse click, right, used to be very easy to do. Not that it's difficult, but you have to take into consideration that now I have a hand attached to it. And if the hand is not, for example, resting on the screen, the hand's up in the air, and I'm trying to do a double mouse click, the chance of me getting a double mouse click with a pen in the exact same area can be challenging. The only point I'm raising here is that you want to give the user a bigger area, or take into consideration that I might lift the pen up and I might come back down slower. Things are just a little bit different. I just need to take those into design considerations. I want to give the user a little bit bigger area for doing a click, a double click. I want to give them possibly a little bit more time, because doing this on a mouse could be a lot faster than raising the pen up and bringing it back down. So it's just all things to take into consideration. Taps can become, it goes with the bigger target area, tap can become a stroke. Because if I take the pen and I put it down and I just slide a little bit, and it's now a stroke. It's not really a tap anymore. So it's just things that you need to consider as you're developing your applications to give the user an easier experience with the tablet. The other thing that I've run into a lot is each tablet has a pen. The pen has, each tablet has a pen, that makes sense. Pen has a button on the tablet. I've seen this a ton of times where the user is writing and their hand slips up, they grab the pen, all of a sudden the button's pressed, and they get completely unexpected results by doing this. My recommendation is always give the user the ability. Some users are they love the fact that the pen, I think it was some of the models, and I won't mention any specifically, but some of the models actually had pens that had 2 buttons on it. And users love to program the pen, or the developers love to program the pen buttons, and a lot of users love to use the different pen buttons, and it works great. I can get a different action just by holding the pen button down. However, to some users, that can be a frustrating thing. If I don't know it's there, if I'm writing and my hand slips on it, all of a sudden my results are different. My recommendation is to give the user the ability to turn off the button. It can be a frustrating experience if I have a 60-year-old banker that's going ahead and writing notes, taking notes, and all of a sudden she clicks and doesn't really realize there's a button, doesn't remember there's a button, and now she switches modes because the drop-down menu comes down and she selected something differently and she doesn't know what's going on. So just things to take into consideration. The other thing that's interesting is when I'm developing my application, pen input, the viewing angle on a desktop, the monitor has always been the same, right, for the most part. Even if I'm using a laptop, it's stationary. I'm always at the same angle. If I have a monitor's in front of me, my eyes are always at the same angle. I see at the same angle. With a tablet, there's times where I could be holding my tablet, up high. There's times I could be holding it down. There's times I could be holding it out. And the viewing angle that I see the tablet could be a little bit different, which means that my pen might not be pointing to the area I actually think it's pointing at based on the angle that I'm holding it, which goes back to the concept of giving the user a bigger target area. Because, perhaps, I'm holding the tablet this way, and I think I'm right on my button, but when I actually look at it, I'm well off. Edge of screen can be difficult to navigate, to scroll up and down on. My recommendation is, I think I talk about this a bit more, Make targets a little bit bigger. Keep things in proximity of each other, because now I'm moving my hand all over the screen. Give them generous areas for the click, double click, tap areas. Provide the ability to turn off the button. Just common things that you don't think about, you don't need to think about with standard Windows development. These are, we've talked about some of the stuff throughout our discussion about scroll bars, close buttons, possibly being at the edge of the UI or too small. One of my favorite things to do is I always give the user a close button on the form. So this makes it, a bigger target, makes it easier to locate and hit as opposed to up at the top. Cursor feedback. I always like to know if the field I'm going to ink in is going to convert to text automatically for me or not. I didn't have to worry about that before. I always like to set a shaded color for things that are not going to convert over that are going to be left as ink. It's a visual cue to the user to know that, oh, I can write. I don't have to wait for this to convert over. There's nothing that's supposed to happen that's not supposed to happen. It's a visual cue to know this is a lightly grayed out field that's going to stay as ink, for example, as opposed to this field, which is clear. It's going to convert over as text. So. The last topic I believe I have is the hardware considerations, and we talked about this a little bit too, also throughout our discussion. One of the second, I think, leading question I get is, what tablets should we buy? We're a Dell shop. What tablets should we buy? We want to buy. We're an HP shop. We want to buy the compact. I always tell everybody, you have to take in consideration what you're going to do with the tablet, and buy the tablet accordingly to what you're going to be used for. If I'm going to be in I'm a claims adjuster, I'm just going to be in the field and back in the car, and in the field and back in the car. Perhaps I don't need a ruggedized device. Perhaps the most important thing in that situation, I'm going to be in someone's home, I can have access to a charger if I need to plug in. Battery life might not be important. In that situation, something like weight might be the most important thing. Perhaps I'm standing up, I'm holding it all day. If I'm going to be out in the field, I'm going to be where it's wet. It's going to be, I need a longer battery life. Maybe a ruggedized version, for example, in those situations would be a lot better than for the lighter version. Or it all depends on how the app's going to be used, what you're going for, as to the hardware that you need to purchase for your tablet app. Yeah, we have actually down in the booth, this is a good plug, down in our exhibit booth, there's pamphlets that talk about the specs. It talks about all the units that are out. I think that's pretty up to date. It talks about the specs of each unit. It talks about battery life. It talks about the processor speed. So it gives a pretty good detail about that. And it has, I think, 2 or 3 of the 4 current ruggedized versions in there. It has the ones that have been announced, let's put it that way. It has the ones that have been announced that are in there. Yes. Great. TabletPC.com. Right. And on there is actually, and I think we still have it, they have the 360-degree viewing angle of all the tablets. So you can actually see, because a lot of times, I've also heard of the last couple of days that I'm having trouble going out. I want to go and play with the tablet before I buy it. I'm having trouble seeing them. For example, CompUSA in California, I heard some around there that CompUSA in California, for some reason, seems to not be carrying them as much. Whether they're out of stock, I don't know what the instance is. But, you can't play with it, obviously, on the website. But you can see the 360-degree angle. I can get a look and feel of what the tablet can do, the functionality of it. And along with that, hardware considerations, there's things that I can do to help myself, to help prolong the battery life. So, example, if I'm going to be along with all the other things I talked about, I often give the user the ability to go ahead and, keep in mind, turn off the wireless, or turn the LCD backlight down, dim it down, turn the monitor off if I'm not using it within 3 minutes. Automatically set that on my tablet so that kind of brain dead situations, but things that can prolong battery life, because battery life has been by far, and no matter what the battery life will be, I believe there will always be complaints. The battery life could be the same as a cell phone. I can use it for 3 days straight, but I'd love to use it for 5 days. I mean, you know, in my mind, battery life is like gas mileage. It's just never good enough. Right. Jump over here. I know I'm in between you and lunch, so I apologize. Really quick, I want to talk about the contest. And I have a little bit of a different slide, but basically, for ISVs to write applications, submit them, the ISV owns the code. Microsoft never gets any of the code. They don't own any of the code. It's purely a contest. It's judged by PC Week, I believe it is, PC Magazine, for $100,000 for the winner, 10 runners-up, $10,000 each, and then one special prize for the most innovative solution of $15,000. Does Your App Think in Ink is a website to go out there for all the details. There's some details, basically the same, maybe a little bit more down at the booth also. And I want to mention, Aaron has a talk at 3:15 today that's going to go over a lot more detail than we went over yesterday about best application, best practices for writing code, I believe it is. And there is, across the hallway, the hands-on lab. If you go ahead and you do the lab, I believe we still have the USB keys. There's just a few USB keys left. All you have to do is go and complete the hands-on lab, and you get a 64 meg USB key. So that's it. Is there any questions? Yes? Yeah, they're on ComNet. Yeah. Yeah. And you know, once again, I don't have it on here. I apologize for being not even up here. KenV is my alias, KENV at Microsoft.com. Feel free to ping me with questions at all, you know, any thoughts, whatever. So, great. Hey, I appreciate you guys taking time away from your lunch to listen to me. Thanks for doing that, and have a good day.